Miss Marple and the village that carried on as though nothing had ever occurred. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome once again to the cosy world of warm chapters. I'm Thomas, and I'm so happy you've joined me this evening. Let us know where you're listening from, and remember to subscribe so you won't miss any new mysteries. Now, make yourself comfortable and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Handbag Beneath the Bridge. Early June came to St. Mary Mead with that air of quiet certainty peculiar to English villages, as though summer had not so much arrived as merely resumed its proper place. The roses along the garden walls were opening steadily, not in any flamboyant haste, but with the composed assurance of flowers that had no need to advertise themselves. The air retained the cool freshness of morning before the sun had quite completed its negotiations with the dew, and the village itself went about its accustomed business in that unhurried, almost ceremonious fashion, which springs from long familiarity with routine. Routine in St. Mary Mead was never merely habit. It was structure, reassurance, and on occasion a most efficient method of concealment. Miss Jane Marple, who lived in a small but exceedingly well-kept house at the end of the lane, had risen early and was engaged in dead-heading the roses by the front path, when she became aware that something unusual had taken place. The awareness did not come dramatically. Miss Marple was not a woman to expect revelations to announce themselves with fanfare. Indeed, she had long observed that the most significant disturbances in human affairs generally made their entrance in the guise of trifles. This one presented itself in the form of Mrs. Dodd's kitchen maid, who passed the lane twice within 10 minutes, moving on each occasion with that curious briskness which indicates not work, but information. There is a difference, and Miss Marple, clipping away a spent bloom with neat precision, recognised it at once. She did not call out. She merely waited. It was Mrs. Margaret Belling who arrived presently at the garden gate, bringing with her the full weight of the matter. Mrs. Belling was one of those women who become, over time, almost inseparable from the organised life of a village. She had served as secretary of the Women's Institute for 11 years in succession, managed fetes, flower schedules, subscription lists, raffle tickets, and the private embarrassments of half the parish with equal efficiency, and possessed the kind of memory that caused honest people to feel admiration and less honest people to feel unease. She was perhaps 65, neat in person, exact in speech, and so firmly composed that one might have likened her to a well-built stone wall, useful, respectable, and not easily moved. "You will have heard," she began, letting herself in with a familiarity long established by village custom, "about the bridge." Miss Marple admitted that she had not, and invited her to sit down in the garden where tea was soon produced, for no matter how interesting the subject, one heard it better with a cup in hand. The bridge in question was the old stone footbridge at Miller's Brook, a narrow, rather picturesque structure at the edge of the lower meadow which had connected lane to church path for longer than anyone now living could precisely remember. It had been in need of repair for months. The parish council had discussed the matter repeatedly and achieved, as parish councils sometimes do, little beyond the discussion itself. At last, however, after a wet March had left the lower stones in a deplorable condition, actual workmen had been engaged. They had begun that morning, and in the course of removing a loose block on the downstream side of the central arch, Hobbs the mason, a steady, practical man who had worked in the village for 30 years and had never, to anyone's knowledge, exaggerated anything, had discovered a cavity in the stone. Inside it lay a small velvet reticule. Even in Mrs. Belling's controlled recital, the word seemed to carry a faint charge. It was not the sort of object one expected to emerge from the fabric of an old bridge. It was faded now to a dusty shade somewhere between plum and burgundy, though time had reduced its richness to a subdued greyish dignity. The clasp remained fastened. Hobbs, being methodical, had opened it with witnesses present, and there was soon no shortage of those. Within were 3 things. First, a slender silver hairpin, tarnished but unbroken, delicate enough to suggest it had once belonged to an elaborate toilette. Second, a folded theatre programme, its edges foxed, its paper softened by age, but still readable, bearing the date of a summer production in 1936. Third, a scrap of paper folded into a small square, on which had been written 2 initials in a neat and careful hand. E.L. At this point, Miss Marple set down her teacup. E.L., she repeated. Evelyn Larch, said Mrs. Belling. She spoke the name steadily enough, but there was in her voice a faint alteration, slight as it was, which would have escaped a less attentive listener. It was not guilt, nor even quite reluctance. Rather, it resembled the discomfort of a person obliged to reopen a drawer that had been shut for many years and had not been intended to open again. Miss Marple knew the name, though not intimately. Evelyn Larch belonged to that category of person whose story survives in a village not through open narration, but through omissions, lowered voices, and the kind of sentence that trails away just before the essential point. She had been, by all accounts, a gifted young woman, active in the village theatricals during the middle 1930s, lively without being vulgar, attractive without apparent effort, and possessed of that natural animation which in a quiet place may be both admired and resented. She had left St. Mary Mead in the summer of 1936. Why she had left had never been plainly stated. No charge had been made, no formal complaint had been recorded, yet something had occurred, something involving a visiting lecturer from Cambridge, something touching on questions of propriety, something that had been treated at the time as regrettable and, by silent agreement, best not enlarged upon. Within a week Evelyn had gone, and the village, having disposed of the matter to its own satisfaction, had continued with its life. But villagers do not forget as thoroughly as they pretend. There had been others at the bridge when the reticule was found. Mr. Arthur Dodd, former churchwarden, had happened to be walking his terrier near the meadow path and had remained throughout, as men of his kind do, not from curiosity exactly, but from a sense that events ought to be witnessed properly. He was a spare man of about 70, weathered rather than old, mild in voice, but capable of holding firm opinions beneath it. He did not waste words. His silences, indeed, were of a particularly expressive sort. Miss Helen Price had arrived later from the Rectory, where she lived quietly following the death of her father, the late Reverend Price. She was a woman of indeterminate age, one of those women whose self-possession makes chronology seem almost irrelevant, and she had known Evelyn Larch better than most. Her father had been vicar at the time, and Miss Helen herself had belonged to the same theatrical company in which Evelyn had once shone so unmistakably. It was Miss Helen, Mrs. Belling said, who had first spoken Evelyn's name aloud when she saw the initials, and it was Mrs. Belling who had immediately suggested that the reticule must simply have been misplaced. By then Miss Marple herself had reached the bridge, guided by that small internal prompt which told her that kitchen maids do not walk fast without reason. She had looked at the faded object where it rested on the mason's folded jacket and then at the people around it. Objects hidden in stone, she had remarked in her mildest tone, are rarely misplaced. There had been a brief silence. Hobbs nodded because he was a sensible man. Mr. Dodd examined the distance. Mrs. Belling observed that it was a pity the season should begin with such unnecessary disturbance, and that in her opinion it would be wiser to let the matter rest. The village, as villages do, had seemed very ready to agree. That readiness remained with Miss Marple as she walked home by the meadow path. It was not true agreement, not in the ordinary sense. It had come too quickly, too uniformly, and with too evident a sense of relief. It was the agreement of people who had not formed an opinion in the moment, but had long been waiting for permission not to think about something. They had received that permission once before, 25 years earlier, and would very much have liked to receive it again. At her own gate, Miss Marple paused and looked back in the direction of Miller's Brook. From there came the resumed ring of hammer against stone, cheerful and practical and very ordinary. She thought of Evelyn Larch, a young woman who had placed in a velvet reticule a theatre programme, a silver hairpin, and and a slip of paper bearing her own initials, and had hidden them not in a drawer, nor burned them, nor thrown them away, but tucked them into the masonry of a bridge. People do not conceal such things if they mean to abandon them. They conceal them if they expect to come back. Evelyn Larch had not come back. Miss Marple went indoors and made herself another pot of tea, for serious reflection is seldom improved by neglecting proper domestic procedure. Seated afterward in her customary chair, she considered the matter with the steady patience she brought to all human puzzles. There is, she reflected, a particular kind of wrong that communities commit not through malice, but through arrangement. It is not brutal, it leaves no obvious mark, it produces no official record and offers afterward so many reasonable explanations that even those involved may come to believe their own version of events. It is done in the name of steadiness, discretion, decency, and all the respectable virtues by which injustice most often disguises itself. That, in some ways, made it the most difficult sort of wrong to uncover. Still, it could be uncovered. She would need to speak at length with Miss Helen Price. She would need to remember exactly who had been present, who had spoken first, and who had most wished the subject closed. And above all, she would need to look carefully at what St. Mary Mead had chosen, a quarter of a century ago, to forget. Chapter 2. Initials stitched in silver thread. By general consent, the reticule had been placed in the keeping of Miss Helen Price. The Rectory was thought a more appropriate repository for such an object than Hobbs's Yard or the parish council office, where it would almost certainly have acquired an unfortunate label and vanished into municipal obscurity. Miss Helen had received it with a seriousness bordering on reverence, and had set it on the writing table in her sitting room beneath the window, where the light fell gently across the faded velvet. Miss Marple called the next morning at 10 o'clock. She had long held that 10 was one of the best hours for useful conversation. By then, people had recovered from the confusion of breakfast, but had not yet begun to glance, however involuntarily, toward the obligations of luncheon. Minds were clearer at 10, memories too, very often. Miss Helen received her warmly. Coffee had been made, and with evident care. The sitting room was exactly the sort of room Miss Marple liked, one which revealed character not by display but by accumulation. There were bookshelves that had plainly surrendered years ago any hope of order, watercolours of local views in modest frames, a work-basket near the hearth, and an embroidery frame set, aside in a manner suggesting temporary interruption rather than abandonment. Everything in the room implied thoughtful use. The reticule stood on the writing table as described. In the clearer morning light, its details emerged more fully. The velvet was faded unevenly. The outer folds had paled and thinned where they had pressed against the stone, while the interior, protected by the lining, still preserved hints of the original rich wine colour. Miss Marple took it up delicately. Along the inside, worked in silver thread, was the monogram, E.L. She examined it as carefully as she might have studied a rare pressed flower. The embroidery was skilful, not ornate, not at all fussy, but neat, upright, and considered. There was character in the stitching, clarity, restraint, and a refusal of unnecessary flourishes. The silver had tarnished to a warm brownish tone, yet when the light struck it obliquely, one could still imagine the brightness it must once have possessed. "Did Evelyn work it herself, do you think?" asked Miss Marple. Miss Helen looked at the initials with a softened expression. "Yes, I believe she did. She was very capable with her hands. She made costumes when the committee purse was insufficient, which was often, and she did it all so expertly that one scarcely noticed the economies. She never fussed, she simply found a way." Miss Marple set the reticule down and accepted a second cup of coffee. "Tell me," she said, "about the summer production, the one for which the programme was kept." Miss Helen leaned back in her chair. She did not hesitate from unwillingness, Miss Marple thought, but from the instinctive care of someone handling memory that had become more fragile with time rather than less. "It was the summer of 1936, Miss Helen said. Our theatrical group, we called ourselves the Mead Players, which seemed very grand at the time, had been performing for some years. Little things mostly. Shakespeare, when we felt ambitious, Christmas entertainments when we did not. That summer we planned a pageant for the village fete. Historical scenes, music, tableau, rather more elaborate than was prudent, but we were all very enthusiastic. And Evelyn? Miss Helen smiled, though there was sadness in it. She was the heart of the company. Not vain, not in the least theatrical in the tiresome sense. She had something much rarer. She understood what she was doing. She did not merely learn lines. She entered into them. She thought about motive, feeling, intention. Even in rehearsal, she gave the impression that what one was seeing was not performance, but reality shaped into form. My father used to say she had the gift of making amateur theatricals seem almost professional, which was high praise indeed from him. Miss Marple listened attentively. Praise of that kind, she knew, is seldom bestowed lightly by the observant. There was a visiting lecturer, she said after a moment. Miss Helen's expression changed, not to alarm, but to precision. Yes, Mr. Lawrence Hale. He was from Cambridge, attached to one of the colleges, though I no longer recall which. He came to consult the church records for some historical research. He was perhaps 30, courteous, reasonably agreeable, and inclined, I think, to be slightly flattered by village hospitality. He attended several rehearsals. He had literary interests, and naturally that made him welcome. And he took an interest in Evelyn Larch. Miss Helen was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said at last, and she in him, but there was nothing improper in it. She spoke with such quiet firmness that the sentence seemed less a recollection than a correction long delayed. I should like that to be clear, she continued, because it was not made clear then, and the failure to make it clear caused a great deal of harm. They enjoyed one another's company. They were intelligent, both of them, and talked easily. In another setting it would have occasioned no more than mild village speculation, and perhaps a little teasing. But the circumstances were not neutral. Because of Mrs. Belling's niece, said Miss Marple. Miss Helen looked at her in unmistakable surprise. You have guessed it. Only because Mrs. Belling was very prompt yesterday, said Miss Marple. When people arrive at a conclusion before they have properly considered the evidence, it sometimes suggests they have been practising that conclusion for years. Miss Helen gave a faint, unwilling smile. Yes, her niece was Caroline Marsh, a perfectly pleasant girl, but not a remarkable one. That spring she had become engaged to a young man from a family of considerably better standing than her own, and Mrs. Belling was intensely occupied with ensuring that the connection should be seen as sound, respectable, and advantageous. Caroline was in the theatrical group. In a small role, she liked being included. She had no real gift for acting, though she enjoyed costume fittings and committee teas. Mr. Hale was always perfectly civil to her, but he preferred Evelyn's company, and anyone with eyes could see it. Miss Marple nodded. There are few forces more powerful in a village than what everyone with eyes can see, followed closely by what those same people choose afterward to imply. Observation, she said softly, is one thing. Commentary is another. The trouble is that in a place like this, the first very quickly turns into the second. Yes, said Miss Helen, and commentary turns to opinion before anyone has troubled to ask whether it was justified in the first place. She looked toward the reticule again. Mrs. Belling was determined there should be no awkwardness attached to the Mead players. At least that was how she would have put it. Respectability mattered to her tremendously, and Caroline's engagement mattered even more. Anything that suggested emotional confusion, rivalry, or impropriety within the company would have reflected badly, if not directly on Caroline, then by association. And association in a village is often enough. There was no bitterness in Miss Helen's voice, but there was something perhaps more telling. The weariness of someone who had understood an injustice perfectly at the time and been unable to prevent it. I do not think, she said carefully, that Mrs. Belling wished Evelyn active harm. That would be too simple, and not quite true. But she was a woman very much accustomed to arranging the social atmosphere around her. She knew who ought to be encouraged, who ought to be overlooked, what should be repeated, and what must never be said plainly, It was all done, one might claim, for the general good. Miss Marple stirred her coffee. "Yes," she said. "That is so often how harm is done." Miss Helen folded her hands in her lap. "I believe Evelyn knew what was happening," she said after a moment. "She was perceptive. One had only to enter a rehearsal room and she could tell at once whether something had shifted. But how was she to answer it? No accusation was ever made. No one said openly that she had behaved badly. There were only silences, changed tones, sudden exclusions, and the dreadful moral pressure of things left just unsaid enough to be denied later. "You cannot defend yourself," said Miss Marple, "against a suggestion that remains forever in the air and never quite settles into words." "Exactly." For a little while neither spoke. Then Miss Marple rose, thanked her hostess sincerely for the coffee and the conversation, and moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused, as if recalling some minor detail. "The programme," she said. "It was for The Tempest." "Yes." Evelyn had the principal role? She was to play Miranda. Miss Helen's voice altered very slightly. "She would have been excellent. But she never performed it." "No," said Miss Helen. "The rehearsal was cancelled before that, and after that everything changed." Miss Marple walked home along the lane in the mild warmth of late morning, her steps as unhurried as ever. A blackbird was singing from the copper beech at the corner, and she noticed it with pleasure, because it was her habit never to cease observing the natural world, simply because the human one had become complicated. The monogram remained in her thoughts. Those 2 letters, worked in silver thread with such care, had not been an idle decoration. They were a mark of ownership, identity, and expectation. Someone had embroidered them, placed the reticule in safety, and surely meant to reclaim it. It had not been discarded, nor hidden in panic, nor thrown away in despair. It had been preserved. That was important. She had now, Miss Marple felt, a better understanding of the kind of machinery by which a respectable village might quietly ruin a young woman without ever admitting to itself what it had done. There had been interest, observation, management, implication, and at the centre of it all the one person least protected against such forces, the young woman who could be spoken of without being defended. But questions remained. The crucial matter was no longer whether Evelyn Larch had been wronged. Of that Miss Marple was already nearly certain. The real question was how the matter had been accomplished in practice. What was said, by whom, on which evening, and under what appearance of reason. And for that, she thought, she must learn exactly what had happened on the night the rehearsal was cancelled. Chapter 3. The Rehearsal That Never Took Place. The parish chest occupied one entire wall of the vestry at St. Mary Mead Church, and had done so, by all appearances, for a period sufficiently long to discourage any precise inquiry into its origins. It was a large, solemn piece of furniture, constructed of oak that time had darkened to the colour of strong tea, and fitted with 3 separate locks whose history seemed to have consisted largely of being misplaced, rediscovered, misplaced again, and, in one memorable instance, replaced by a key that did not properly fit and had to be persuaded to turn with a degree of patience more commonly reserved for stubborn human beings. The present custodian of these keys was Mr. Gerald Timms, the verger, a mild and sandy-haired person of indeterminate middle age who possessed that air of resigned usefulness, characteristic of men who have long accepted that their chief purpose in life is to be available whenever availability is required, and unnoticed whenever it is not. He wore the same expression whether arranging hymn books, carrying coal, or receiving distinguished visitors, and in Miss Marple's opinion had one of the most valuable qualities a witness could possess. He had no interest whatever in the grandeur of his own opinions. Such people, as she had often observed, are far more likely to remember what happened than what ought, in retrospect, to have happened. Miss Marple had attended the Wednesday morning communion service, as was her custom, and had remained behind to ask whether the parish records for the summer of 1936 might still be consulted. Mr. Timms had produced 2 of the 3 keys from his coat pocket, with the calm practicality of a man accustomed to carrying such objects about his person, and led her into the vestry without the least appearance of considering the request remarkable. Access to old papers, in his view, was evidently one of those unexciting but legitimate features of church life that required no commentary beyond a slight adjustment of the spectacles. The records for that year were contained in 2 cardboard folders tied with ribbon that had once been red and was now faded to a weary coral. They lay inside a wooden box which smelled pleasantly of cedar, dust, and old ink. Miss Marple carried them to the small table beneath the vestry's narrow window and began to read. Most of what the folders contained was exactly what parish records generally contain: the patient accumulation of ordinary life rendered permanent by ink. There were accounts of committee meetings, notices of baptisms and burials, correspondence with the diocese concerning the roof, memoranda about the flower festival, and 3 pages of minutes so densely concerned with lilies that one gained the distinct impression the matter had aroused more passion than the occasion strictly justified. Miss Marple read these documents with the same care she brought to everything else. It was one of her established principles that useful information seldom announces itself in advance, and that the most revealing detail may lie in a passage others skip out of boredom. She found what she wanted on a loose handwritten sheet tucked between the June and July minutes. The note recorded that the rehearsal of the Tempest, scheduled for the evening of the 14th of June 1936, had been cancelled at short notice. The reason given was brief. A scheduling difficulty had arisen. Nothing further followed. The note was unsigned. Yet it had been preserved among the official papers, which suggested either authority or access. And Miss Marple, who had known many instances in which access was more influential than authority, found this worth remembering. Beneath it, folded rather than properly filed, lay another paper, one that had clearly not belonged among the routine records, and had perhaps been slipped there by someone uncertain whether to preserve it or conceal it. Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. It was the record of a small committee meeting. No date appeared upon the page, but its position among the documents placed it unmistakably within the same fortnight. She read it once, then a second time, her pale eyes growing a shade more thoughtful with each line. When at last she returned the papers to their places, she did so with the delicate precision of a person who intends to revisit them and wishes them to remain exactly as found. She thanked Mr. Timms, who seemed neither surprised nor curious, replaced the folders in the cedar box, and made her way out into the churchyard. The late morning sun had warmed the stones pleasantly. At the eastern corner the old yew tree cast a steady patch of shade over a cluster of gravestones that had long since accepted darkness as part of their permanent arrangement. 2 collared doves conducted a subdued and rather complacent conversation in the lime tree by the gate. Miss Marple paused near the path and read the inscription on a nearby stone, not because she felt any particular interest in the deceased, but because she had often found that directing the eye outward for a moment helped the mind order what it had gathered. She was still thus engaged when she became aware that she was no longer alone. Mr. Arthur Dodd stood, some 10 yards away, his hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the middle distance with the expression of a man who has either fallen into private thought or is deciding whether a conversation is unavoidable. Miss Marple waited. Mr. Dodd was one of those men who always arrived at the point in his own manner and in his own time, and she had long since learned that any attempt to hurry him generally reduced rather than improved the quality of the result. After a moment he came across the path and halted beside her. "Saw you going into the vestry earlier," he said. "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "The parish records." It was not a question. "The parish records," she agreed. He was silent for a little while. Above them the doves continued their gentle exchange with the composed indifference of creatures who take no active interest in human complications, but appear, on the whole, not displeased by them. "There won't be much there," Mr. Dodd said at length. "About that summer, I shouldn't think." "There is a note about the cancelled rehearsal," said Miss Marple. "Rather brief, and some committee minutes which interested me very much." Something altered in his face then. It was a very slight change, no more than a tightening about the eyes, but in a man who ordinarily kept his features under such decent control, it was sufficiently marked. "Minutes," he repeated. "From a small meeting," said Miss Marple, in the tone one might use of rainfall or roses. "Not one of the regular committee gatherings, I think. Only 4 names were listed as present. Mrs. Belling, the late Reverend Price, Mr. Fowler, who I believe was parish treasurer at the time, and yourself." The doves rose suddenly from the lime tree with a brief clatter of wings. Mr. Dodd watched them go. "That would have been a routine meeting," he said. "There were administrative matters that summer." "I am sure there were." Miss Marple said nothing. More. She merely allowed the silence that followed to settle and remain where it was. Silence, she had long believed, is one of the most effective instruments available to a truthful mind. It does not force. It merely leaves space into which other people may place what they can no longer comfortably keep to themselves. Mr. Dodd withstood it longer than many would have done. He was not a weak man. But neither was he a hardened one, and after 40 years of church life there remained in him, Miss Marple suspected, a deep structural vulnerability to direct honesty. At last he spoke. "The rehearsal was cancelled," he said, "because there had been a difficulty. A concern, I should say. That was the word used at the time. A concern about Miss Larch, about the situation, about how it appeared." He spoke carefully, as a man handling objects that have lain packed away for many years, and may no longer be stable when exposed to air. "There had been remarks from various quarters," he went on. "Mrs. Belling took the view that the rehearsal ought to be postponed until the matter had been considered. I thought it reasonable at the time. The theatrical group reflected on the wider parish, and there had been talk." "What sort of talk?" asked Miss Marple, though she knew well enough the species of it. Mr. Dodd turned and looked at her directly. "The sort that has no particular foundation," he said. "The sort that begins when someone of influence suggests, in the course of ordinary conversation, that a situation bears watching." Mrs. Belling had spoken to several people, always very properly, always with an air of concern for everyone involved. By the time it reached the meeting, the thing had acquired a weight it had not possessed at the start. And Miss Larch, he paused, she was not consulted. She was not at the meeting. He said it without emphasis, but the lack of emphasis only made the fact clearer. Was she told of the concern? She was informed that the rehearsal had been postponed. His voice grew more restrained still. "I believed that someone would speak to her directly. I assumed there would be an explanation. Later I discovered there had been none. By the time I thought to ask, she had already left the village." Miss Marple considered him quietly. "Do you remember," she asked, "whether the dates are exact? The note mentions the 14th. The committee paper is undated, and I'm trying to establish the sequence." Mr. Dodd stood very still. "The rehearsal was on Friday evening," he said after a moment. "The 14th. The meeting was 2 days earlier, Wednesday the 12th. So the decision preceded the cancellation?" "Yes." "Then the cancellation was not the result of any sudden occurrence on the evening itself," said Miss Marple gently. "It was a decision made privately in advance, and later presented as an administrative necessity." For the first time, something appeared in his face that it was painful to see. Not guilt exactly, not the immediate form of it, at any rate. 25 years had altered and softened the original feeling, but this was certainly its descendant, wearing the same family resemblance in the line of the mouth and the particular tiredness of the eyes. "I did not think," he said, "that it would lead to what it led to." "I believe you," said Miss Marple. She meant it wholly, and perhaps because she did, the words carried more force than sympathy often does. She left him there by the path, standing in the pleasant June warmth with the churchyard quiet around him, and walked to the gate with her usual unhurried step. She had no wish to cause unnecessary pain. But neither, she felt, could one honestly pretend that pain had no proper place in a matter where conscience had been so long deferred. What she possessed now was not merely impression, but sequence. A private meeting on the Wednesday. A cancellation on the Friday. Evelyn Larch gone within the week. not the natural consequence of some unfortunate incident, but the likely outcome of a decision taken in a small room by 4 people, without the knowledge of the one person most affected by it. As she passed through the gate into the lane, Miss Marple thought again of something Helen Price had mentioned. Raised voices heard in the corridor of the village hall after the decision had already been reached. Raised voices afterward were, she reflected, a very different thing from raised voices before. There remained much to be learned about Friday evening, and it occurred to her that Mrs. Finch, who had worked at the Rectory in those days, and who now lived in the little cottage near the post office, might remember rather more than anyone had yet found convenient to mention. Chapter 4. Cherries. Scattered across the gravel. Mrs. Edna Finch lived in a cottage of the kind that appears in watercolours and on biscuit tins, though in her case any impression of idealised rural gentility was complicated by 4 cats, an exceptionally vigorous vegetable plot, and a wireless set of advanced years that seemed permanently engaged in broadcasting some earnest instruction to the nation. When Miss Marple knocked on the door that Thursday afternoon, the wireless was discoursing upon beekeeping at a volume which suggested either enthusiasm or mild deafness. Mrs. Finch turned it down with the untroubled efficiency of a woman who has managed her own household for the better part of 60 years and does not propose to be flurried by visitors, however worthy. She received Miss Marple in the kitchen, where the kettle was already in a promising state, and a plate of shortbread appeared with such speed that one felt tea had been not merely offered, but morally ordained. She was a stout and comfortable-looking woman with white hair pinned up in an arrangement which had likely begun the day with higher ambitions than it had managed to retain, and bright hazel eyes that missed distinctly less than her general air of domestic softness implied. She had worked at the Rectory, she explained, from 1932 until 1941, when the war had rearranged local life along with everything else. The late Reverend Price had been a fair employer, Miss Helen a kind child, and the house itself, on the whole, a pleasant place in which to serve. She spoke of those years not with the polished sentiment people sometimes attach to the past, but with the warm exactness of genuine recollection, and Miss Marple found that reassuring. "I remember Evelyn Larch perfectly well," Mrs. Finch said, before any elaborate approach to the subject had become necessary. She spoke with the composure of a woman who had known from the beginning why Miss Marple had come, and had merely waited a suitable interval for the conversation to reach its proper destination. "I wondered, when I heard about that little bag being found, whether someone might come and ask me about it," she continued. "I am glad it is you." Miss Marple, who was accustomed to being regarded by a particular class of sensible person as the natural recipient of inconvenient truths, accepted this with modest composure. "She was a lovely young woman," said Mrs. Finch, settling herself more comfortably in her chair. "Not lovely in a picture postcard fashion, not that sort at all, but alive. That was the thing. She made a room feel more inhabited when she was in it. You noticed when she was gone, even if you had not quite realised before how much you had noticed her there." "She came often to the Rectory?" asked Miss Marple. "That summer, yes. She and Miss Helen were close as 2 girls can be when one has had rather more opportunity than the other, and is generous enough never to make it felt. Miss Helen had her place in the world settled. Evelyn's was not so secure. She had talent and spirit, but not much family. Support. She lived in rooms above the lending library with a distant aunt who was delicate and had no patience with theatricals." Miss Marple thought of the reticule again, and of the neat silver monogram worked into its lining by a hand at once careful and self-respecting. "Tell me," she said, "about the evening of the 14th of June, the evening the rehearsal was cancelled." Mrs. Finch poured the tea with a steady hand and was quiet for a few moments, not evasively, but with the deliberate concentration of someone to whom accuracy matters. "I had been at the Rectory later than usual that afternoon," she said. "There was a small dinner coming up the following week, and some linen needed attention. It was after 6 when I finished. I came out by the side passage, the tradesman's way, across the gravel near the garden wall, and there I saw Evelyn. She placed the teapot down and folded her hands. She was coming round from the direction of the high gate, the one that opened onto the lane the players used when they came for rehearsal at the hall. She was carrying a basket of cherries. I remember noticing them because it seemed an odd thing to be carrying at that hour. I thought perhaps she had brought them for the house, as she did little things of that sort now and then when she came to see Miss Helen. She was walking normally. Yes, and then something happened. Mrs. Finch's expression sharpened a little, not with drama, but with the authority of a memory that had remained singularly clear. She heard something, or someone spoke. It came from the direction of the garden gate. She stopped all at once. She was startled, said Miss Marple. She was struck, said Mrs. Finch with quiet precision. That is nearer. It was the look of a person who has received information she did not expect and did not welcome. Not frightened exactly, not angry, not at first, simply arrested, as though her feet had understood something before the rest of her had. And the cherries? The basket tipped. Whether it slipped from her hand or caught against the gate-post as she turned, I could not say, but it fell, and the cherries scattered all across the gravel, rolled everywhere, right up to the wall. For a moment the kitchen seemed even stiller than before. One of the cats outside was engaged in some private dispute near the bean row, but the sound came dimly through the open window and did not disturb the shape of the recollection. She looked down at them, Mrs. Finch said, and she did not move. Not for a moment. She just stood there looking at those cherries on the stones. Her voice had changed. There was in it the peculiar gravity of witnessed sorrow remembered too long. I have thought about that instant many times, she said. There was something in the way she looked down that told me she understood something had happened which could not be put back as it was before. Did you see who spoke to her? Not clearly. The gate was half open and the light was behind it. I had the impression of a figure. A woman, I thought, from the movement. She stepped back as Evelyn turned, but I would not swear to the identity. I can only say what I saw. What did you feel? Asked Miss Marple. Mrs. Finch did not appear surprised by the question. That what was said had been said on purpose, she answered. A person who has blundered into cruelty has a way of coming forward, trying to mend it or soften it or explain. This person stepped back. That is the movement of someone who has said precisely what she meant to say and sees no advantage in repeating it. Miss Marple let that rest between them for a little while, and then reached for a piece of shortbread. Did you speak to Evelyn? I asked whether she wanted help with the basket. She said, No, thank you, it was nothing. Very steady she was. She could be composed when she had reason, but I helped her gather them up all the same. They were good cherries for one thing, and for another one does not leave a girl standing alone with fallen fruit and a face like that if one can help it. Did she say anything else? Mrs. Finch nodded slowly. Yes, she said something I have never forgotten, though I did not entirely understand it then. Very quietly, almost to herself, she said, I did not know it required defending. Miss Marple did not speak. She said it as if something had just been presented to her, Mrs. Finch continued. Something she had not known was under attack until that moment. Then she took up the basket and went back the way she had come. She did not go in to see Miss Helen. She did not go on to the rehearsal. I learned the next day that the rehearsal had been cancelled, though not, it seemed, with sufficient promptness to inform everybody in good time. The afternoon had grown softer while she spoke. Through the window, the light lay warm across the path, and the long shadows of the runner beans had begun to stretch themselves into evening. Miss Marple finished her tea, thanked her hostess with sincere warmth, and stepped out into the lane with that absorbed and thoughtful expression which, to those who knew her, signified that a number of separate facts had just found their correct relation to one another. Evelyn had not known of the meeting. She had not known of the committee's concern. She had arrived on Friday evening carrying cherries, expecting rehearsal, perhaps expecting to see Helen first, and at the Rectory gate someone had stepped from the garden shadows and, in a few carefully chosen words, made clear that she was no longer welcome. The question that accompanied Miss Marple all the way down the lane was not, in truth, who that figure had been. On that point she had already formed a reasonable suspicion. The real question was what precisely had been said. Because whatever those quiet words across the gravel had been, Evelyn had not interpreted them merely as social management or tactful exclusion. She had understood something graver, that she stood accused in some way she had never imagined needed answering, and that a defence was expected where none should ever have been required. By the time Miss Marple reached her own gate, the first swallows of the evening were beginning their swift turns above the lane. It seemed to her that this was a very particular kind of cruelty, one that operated entirely through implication, and so left no visible wound upon the surface, only the permanent injury of a thing suggested, believed, and never openly spoken. Chapter 5. The Sealed Drawer in the Rectory Study. The Rectory had been built in the latter half of the previous century by a vicar whose ambitions had been distinctly greater than his architectural judgment, with the result that it possessed more rooms than any ordinary clerical household could comfortably inhabit. Its staircase turned twice where once would plainly have sufficed, and its windows had been arranged in such a manner that morning light entered with generosity, while the afternoon, for reasons best known to the original designer, was admitted only grudgingly. Miss Helen Price, having lived there since birth, had long since arrived at that peaceful accommodation, with its peculiarities which comes only from a combination of affection, endurance, and the absence of any practical alternative. She received Miss Marple on Friday morning with the air of someone who had been expecting such a visit, not necessarily upon that exact day, but certainly upon one very like it, and led her at once into the study without the shelter of preliminary conversation. This directness, which was one of Miss Helen's more admirable qualities, Miss Marple found entirely agreeable. The room had belonged to the late Reverend Price, and it retained his presence in the manor rooms sometimes do when they have been occupied for many years by one serious and habitual mind. There was no sense of deliberate preservation. Rather, one felt that character had settled into the room by long usage. The shelves held theology, church history, and the occasional excursion into natural philosophy, while one entire section, slightly incongruous, yet obviously beloved, was devoted to railway timetables of various vintages. The desk was large, plain, and entirely sensible, with a leather writing surface worn smooth in the middle, and it stood squarely before the garden window, framed by lawn and copper beech, in a way that suggested that whatever errors had been made elsewhere in the building, the Reverend had at least understood where a man ought to place a desk. "My father kept all parish correspondence," Miss Helen said, producing a small key from the ring she carried in her cardigan pocket. "Everything officially significant he filed in the cabinet in the hall. Those are the papers that went eventually to the parish chest, but correspondence he regarded as pastoral rather than administrative he kept here, in his own desk." She paused at the lower right-hand drawer and fitted the key. "I have never looked at most of it," she added. "It seemed private in a way the official records did not. But since the reticule was found, I have thought there may be things here that bear on what happened to Evelyn." The drawer opened with the faint reluctance of wood long undisturbed, and revealed a number of papers arranged with that kind of careful order which reflects not fussiness, but discipline. Miss Helen stepped back. Miss Marple seated herself at the desk and began to read. The upper contents of the drawer proved, for the most part, to concern matters both private and irrelevant to the present inquiry. There were letters from a former parishioner in difficult circumstances, notes concerning a theological discussion group, and a brief but rather heated exchange with the diocesan office on some point of liturgical practice, which had evidently exercised the late Reverend more than it might have exercised many men. Miss Marple examined these with respect and without undue attention, returning each to its place precisely as found. It was only toward the back of the drawer, beneath a shallow wooden divider which was not quite a false bottom, but had something of the same discreet intention, that she found what she was looking for. It was a memorandum. The paper was cream-laid stock of the sort the committee had once used for formal correspondence, though this particular sheet bore no printed heading and no date. It had been folded once across the middle, and the fold had that unmistakable quality belonging to documents that have been read, considered, and then kept. Not filed indifferently, but retained with purpose. The handwriting, neat, regular, and faintly backslanting, Miss Marple recognised at once. She had seen it often enough on women's Institute circulars over the years. Mrs. Belling. Miss Marple read the memorandum with great care. It opened with expressions of continued admiration for the Mead players and of personal regard for all associated with them. The sentence structure was careful, the tone gracious, the entire opening paragraph shaped with the sort of cultivated moderation by which unpleasant intentions are so often introduced into respectable life. The second paragraph proceeded to note that recent rehearsal evenings had given rise, in the observation of several committee members, to a situation of some delicacy. A member of the theatrical company, it said, had formed what was described as a notable attachment to a visiting academic in circumstances which, while not susceptible to direct criticism, had nevertheless become a matter of comment among parishioners, whose goodwill toward the group was of importance to its continued standing. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the third paragraph, and there she slowed. The committee, it said, did not wish to act precipitately or unkindly, and had therefore concluded that the most considerate course open to it was to recommend in the strongest possible terms that Miss Larch be advised to withdraw from the summer pageant, and from the theatrical group's activities generally, for a period sufficient to allow the present comment to subside. Such a course, the memorandum continued, served the interests of harmony, of the parish's reputation, and, here the phrasing became, if possible, even more carefully polished, of Miss Larch herself, who would surely benefit from a period of quieter association with the village, while the current misunderstanding resolved itself. At the bottom of the page, below the memorandum itself, appeared a line in a different hand. Miss Marple recognised that at once too. The Reverend Price had written, "I do not think this can be done without speaking to the young woman first." Beneath that, added later in another pen, were the words, "M.B. has undertaken to do so herself." For a few moments Miss Marple remained perfectly still. From the garden came the voice of a wood-pigeon in the copper beech, repeating its observation with that calm and slightly self-important persistence peculiar to the species, while somewhere beyond the hedge someone was trimming something with garden shears. The ordinary sounds of the morning seemed only to sharpen the gravity of what lay on the desk before her. Presently she rose and carried the memorandum to Miss Helen, who sat waiting in the armchair by the fireplace with composed hands and a face that suggested the waiting had cost rather more than it showed. Miss Helen read it in silence. As she did so, her expression altered in a sequence Miss Marple thought very telling. It was not the shock of discovery, it was the look of confirmed suspicion, the sober settling of something long feared and now formally established. When she had finished, she sat for a moment, longer with the paper in her hands, and then looked up. "He did not agree," she said quietly. "That is evident. He believed she should have been spoken to directly, honestly, and in time to answer." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And Mrs. Belling undertook to do so herself." Miss Helen looked again at the memorandum. "My father," she said after a pause, "would have told her the truth. He was not in all things a robust man, and he could certainly be overborne by stronger personalities, but he would not have deceived a young woman in order to spare the village discomfort. He would have explained the committee's position, acknowledged that she had done nothing wrong, and left her free to make her own decision. Instead," said Miss Marple, resuming her seat, "she received, at a garden gate, from a woman whose social authority was not easily challenged, some carefully prepared communication of sufficient force to make her feel ashamed of something she had not known required defending." Miss Helen's hands tightened slightly upon the paper. "That phrase," she said, "has remained with me ever since you mentioned it. It explains everything. Evelyn didn't leave because she'd done anything wrong." She left because she was made to feel that the very existence of a question about her conduct was already a kind of verdict, and no one told her otherwise in time. The room was very quiet. At length Miss Marple said, "The memorandum is signed. Your father retained it, together with his own annotation." "Yes," said Miss Helen. "I think that was deliberate. He knew it was wrong. He did not prevent it. He was not, I think, sufficiently certain of his own authority over Mrs. Belling in such matters, and by the time he had gathered himself the damage had already been done. But he kept the evidence, perhaps because he felt he owed that much to Evelyn, perhaps because keeping it was the least inadequate reparation available to him." There was such fairness in this, and such humanity, that Miss Marple made no effort to improve upon it. Before leaving, she replaced the memorandum exactly where it had lain, beneath the shallow divider in the lower right-hand drawer of the Reverend Price's desk. It had rested there for 25 years in the custody of a man who had recognised wrong, and failed, in the decisive moment, to stop it. It seemed fitting that it should remain there a little longer. As Miss Marple walked home through the Rectory garden, skirting the copper beech, she paused at the gate that opened onto the gravel. She stood a moment considering what it must have been to arrive there on a June evening in 1936, carrying a basket of cherries and expecting rehearsal, companionship, and the ordinary pleasures of a summer evening, and to find instead a woman of great composure, waiting with sentences already arranged. It was not, Miss Marple thought, a comfortable thing to picture, but one owed at least that much to the person who had once stood there. Chapter 6. A look across the croquet lawn. In the years of the Mead players' greatest activity, summer rehearsals had been held partly in the village hall, and partly, when weather and theatrical ambition combined to make it desirable, upon the grounds of Ash Manor. The house, situated at the northern edge of the village, possessed that species of modest grandeur which, in England, is often more persuasive than magnificence. Its owner in those days, Mrs. Viola Kendrick, had been a generous patron of the theatrical group, and one of those rare women whose social confidence was sufficient to render them entirely immune to Mrs. Belling's organisational authority. Mrs. Kendrick had died in 1954. Ash Manor had passed to a nephew who used it infrequently, and maintained it chiefly through the agency of a land agent, whose principal gifts appeared to be economy and the total absence of aesthetic conscience. The grounds, once carefully ordered, had since entered that state of mild and rather romantic neglect which English gardens sometimes wear to advantage. The croquet lawn in particular, formerly the pride of Mrs. Kendrick's domestic administration, had not, Miss Helen believed, seen a mallet in 7 years. It was on this lawn that Lawrence Hale had stood in animated conversation with Evelyn Larch one afternoon in the early summer of 1936, under circumstances Miss Helen had witnessed from the terrace and had never wholly forgotten. Miss Marple had asked whether she would walk there with her on Saturday morning and describe what she remembered. Miss Helen had agreed at once. The day was one of those English June mornings which appear so simple that one forgets how rare they are. Clear, warm without excess, and held beneath a pale, generous blue sky that made everything in the countryside look as though it had lately been washed and left out to dry. They walked by the lane to the manor at a pace suited equally to conversation and to hedgerow roses, and Miss Helen, as they went, spoke with the measured fluency of someone revisiting a memory long preserved with care. She had been on the terrace that afternoon, she said, dealing with some correspondence on behalf of her father, who had asked her to deliver several letters to Mrs. Kendrick while she was there for a rehearsal meeting. The meeting had ended earlier than expected, and she'd remained on the terrace to finish a letter in the pleasant air before returning home. Evelyn and Mr. Hale had come onto the croquet lawn from the direction of the garden passage. Miss Helen supposed they had been walking together from the hall where the meeting had been held. They had then stopped near the far hoop and talked for some time. "I could not hear what they said," she told Miss Marple as they turned in through the iron gate, "and I made no attempt to move closer because at the time I had no reason to suppose their conversation was anything but perfectly ordinary. "What did you notice then?" asked Miss Marple. "The manner of it," Miss Helen replied. "Mr. Hale talked a great deal. He was an animated man, the kind who uses his hands when he speaks, and Evelyn listened, not passively, but with real attention. That was very characteristic of her. She listened as though the thing being said mattered. The grounds received them with the agreeable disarray of years of gentle neglect. The gravel path from the gate had made its peace with the grass that edged it. The rose beds along the south wall had abandoned all memory of discipline, and the croquet lawn remained recognisable chiefly through its old flatness and the presence of 2 iron hoops still leaning at improbable angles in the sun. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the terrace and looked across the lawn. "And Mrs. Belling observed them as well," she said. It was not quite a question. Miss Helen came to stand beside her. "Yes," she said. "She was at the window of the inner parlour. I noticed her when I glanced toward the house, though I cannot now remember why I looked. She was not watching me. She was watching the lawn. For how long? I cannot say exactly. Some minutes certainly. Long enough that when I looked again, she was still there." Miss Marple considered the distance between the parlour window and the far hoop. It was not great. On a clear June afternoon, 2 people standing in animated conversation on a level lawn would have been plainly visible to any intelligent observer. Their words would not have carried, but their expressions, their gestures, and the sort of inference an interested mind might choose to draw from them would have been entirely accessible. "Mrs. Belling," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "is a woman who reaches conclusions very quickly, and acts upon them before they have had time to be questioned. It is a quality of considerable use in administration. Under certain conditions, it is also one of the surest instruments of injustice." Miss Helen was silent for a little while. Then she said something that Miss Marple thought required no small courage. "She is not fundamentally a malicious woman," Miss Helen said. "I have been trying since Tuesday to decide whether she knew exactly what she was doing to Evelyn, whether she intended the full consequence of it, and I find I cannot wholly decide. What I believe is that she saw what she wanted to see on that lawn, formed the conclusion that suited her purpose, and then acted upon it with such thoroughness that no room was left for the possibility that she had been mistaken." "The most dangerous conclusions," said Miss Marple gently, "are often those formed by intelligent people who are also, in some other part of themselves, interested parties." They walked slowly around the lawn, not because the ground itself required examination, but because motion often assists the kind of thought that resists direct pressure. At the far side, near a crumbling stone wall warm with sunlight, Miss Marple asked, "What did Mr. Hale make of it all? Did he understand anything had been set in motion?" "I do not believe he understood anything whatever," said Miss Helen. "He left the village the morning after the cancelled rehearsal. He had an engagement in Cambridge, and his plans did not alter. He said his farewells, I believe, at the post office, entirely unaware that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. He was not present at the committee discussions. He was not in the village when Evelyn received whatever Mrs. Belling said to her at the gate. As far as he knew, he had spent a pleasant few weeks in agreeable company and departed at the natural conclusion of them. And afterward, he married some years later, someone from Cambridge, I was told. Miss Jessup at the post office had a cousin who knew the family slightly." Miss Helen paused and looked back across the lawn, toward the terrace. "I've sometimes wondered whether he ever thought of Evelyn," she said, "whether he had any idea their conversations here had been observed and interpreted." "I rather think he did not," said Miss Marple. "The innocence of Mr. Hale was not, strictly speaking, a complication. It had been evident from the beginning that the wrong done to Evelyn had not required his participation, nor even his awareness. Yet it added a particular colour to the matter, that the man whose presence had been used as the instrument of her displacement had passed without injury into the ordinary continuation of his life, while all the consequence through the careful management of others had been arranged for her." "Appearances matter more than intent," said Miss Marple half to herself. Miss Helen looked at her. "That," Miss Marple continued, "was what Mrs. Belling said, was it not? It is an interesting philosophy because it spares one the labour of discovering what anyone actually meant or did. One need only decide what a thing looks like, and the work is finished. They turned back toward the house along the path by the rose wall, where the roses, having long since ceased to respect their original instructions, were engaged in a cheerful conquest of the coping stones. A bee moved among them with the absorbed efficiency of a creature that knew exactly what it was about, and saw no reason whatever to explain itself. At the gate, Miss Helen stopped and turned once more to look back. "I was there," she said quietly. "I was on that terrace. I saw Mrs. Belling at the window. I knew even then that she was watching with more attention than the occasion warranted." She paused. "I said nothing. I did not ask what she had seen or what she intended. I was young and she was formidable, and I told myself I had no evidence of anything except a woman standing at a window." She turned to Miss Marple with that clear directness which was, in every version of herself, perhaps her most constant quality. "I have never been comfortable about that silence." "You're not comfortable about it now," said Miss Marple, with warmth but no absolution. "That is a very different thing from not caring, and much to your credit." They walked back by the village lane in the easy quiet that sometimes follows serious conversation when it has reached a temporary resting place. The bee from the rose wall accompanied them briefly, and then, with proper good sense, returned to its own business. Later, seated in her garden with her knitting, Miss Marple considered the particular kind of observation which watches and does not intervene, and the difficult question of when such watching becomes complicity, and when it remains merely the human failing of standing still in the presence of something one does not yet know how to stop. There was no simple answer to that. Several people in St. Mary Mead, she thought, had been living with their versions of that question for 25 years, and then another thought came to her. The sketchbook in the pavilion. She set down her knitting for a moment and looked across the garden thoughtfully, for while committees, terraces, and parlour windows might explain what had been decided about Evelyn, the pavilion, she suspected, might yet tell her something more important still. Not what others had thought of her, but what Evelyn herself had understood, felt, and chosen to leave behind. Chapter 7. The Sketchbook Forgotten in the Pavilion. The pavilion at the far edge of the recreation ground had served the village in so many capacities over so many years that it had long since ceased, one felt, to possess any fixed identity of its own. It had housed the Cricket 11's equipment in summer, overflow from the village fete whenever rain chose to intervene without consultation, 3 successive productions by the Mead players involving props too cumbersome for the hall's inadequate store cupboard, and, during one winter of municipal improvisation, a number of sandbags whose precise purpose no one had later been able to explain with real conviction. It was a wooden structure of modest proportions, painted at some point in the previous decade in a shade intended perhaps to be sage green. But weather and time had collaborated to produce something nearer the colour of old pewter. Its iron latch had the plain sturdiness of things made for use rather than charm, and the interior carried the familiar scent of dry timber, dust, and the faint lingering trace of linseed oil from the cricket bat stacked in one corner with a kind of hopeful untidiness. Miss Marple had obtained the key from Miss Jessup at the post office. The key itself was a large and rather weighty specimen, hanging on a hook behind the counter with a settled air, as though both it and the hook had for years understood their relation to one another perfectly. Miss Jessup, who had become by degrees the unofficial administrator of the recreation ground simply by being the sort of woman in whose hands such responsibilities naturally came to rest, had handed it over with cheerful authority and asked no unnecessary questions. Whether this silence arose from discretion or from the superior claims of postal business upon her attention, Miss Marple did not attempt to determine. On Sunday afternoon she went to the pavilion accompanied by Miss Helen Price, whose memory of the Mead players' arrangements was likely to be more useful than any formal record. They found the interior in a condition that suggested intermittent efforts at order by practical people with insufficient time. The cricket equipment had been stacked with reasonable care. Several folding tables leaned against the far wall at angles which made their eventual collapse seem inevitable, though not immediate. Along the left-hand side ran a series of shelves of varying sturdiness, and on these rested the debris of decades of amateur theatricals, rolled canvas backdrops, painted flats, cardboard boxes containing objects that had once been unmistakably costumes or scenery, and had since, through the loss of context, become merely peculiar. Miss Helen crossed at once to the lower shelf nearest the door. "The players always kept current materials here during a production," she said, moving aside a rolled piece of canvas with the confidence of someone who knows where things ought to be, and is not especially surprised when they prove to be there. Scripts, costume notes, working sketches, anything in active use. After a production ended, the proper intention was that such things should be transferred into the general store, but in practice people simply left them here at the end of rehearsals and took them up again the next evening. She crouched, shifted a cardboard box containing several stage crowns in varying degrees of structural collapse, and drew out a slim volume bound in dark blue cloth. Its corners were worn, and there was a stain along the spine which might have been paint or merely the slow handiwork of years. Miss Helen held it for a moment before passing it to Miss Marple, with a gravity one might have reserved for something both ordinary and intimate, the kind of object which has waited a very long time for someone to understand what it contains. Miss Marple carried it to the doorway, where the afternoon light fell most usefully, and opened it. The sketchbook was Evelyn's beyond any doubt. Her name appeared on the inside cover in the same neat, upright hand that had written the initials on the folded paper from the reticule, and the first entry, dated March 1936, established it as a working record of that summer's theatrical season. The early pages were devoted to costume designs of very evident skill, pencil studies accompanied by colour notes, fabric suggestions, measurements, and brief technical remarks written in the margins with a discipline that suggested both talent and application. There were designs for the historical pageant, each figure rendered with more attention to period than amateur production commonly receives, and several studies for Miranda's costume in The Tempest, drawn with that quality of quiet intelligence which separates the merely competent from the genuinely gifted. Miss Marple turned these pages slowly with real appreciation. Whatever else the sketchbook was, it was first an object of work, good work, careful work, work done by someone who believed what she was making mattered. Further on, the designs gave way to notes, remarks on rehearsal entrances, costume sourcing, small practical difficulties of staging, and brief observations upon character of the kind an intelligent actress records for her own use. The tone was precise without coldness, observant without malice. One felt, reading them, the presence of a mind accustomed to accuracy and restrained enough to value it. Then, near the back of the book, separated from the earlier pages by a blank leaf, Miss Marple found the pencilled sentence she had half expected, and yet, when she saw it, found unexpectedly affecting. The handwriting was the same, but altered by circumstance. The letters were larger than Evelyn's usual script, the pressure uneven, the pencil strokes more heavily driven into the paper. It was the writing of someone setting something down quickly, before the exactness of the feeling could blur into something more manageable. The words were these: "I did not expect kindness to be withdrawn, that was all." There was no date, no name, no elaboration. Miss Marple read the sentence once, then again, and then a third time. Behind her, beyond the pavilion, the recreation ground carried on with its ordinary Sunday life. Distant children, a dog barking with unnecessary conviction, the subdued companionableness of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Those peaceful sounds seemed only to make the written words more exact in their injury. After a moment she turned the sketchbook so that Miss Helen could read the page. Miss Helen read it silently, and then looked out across the grass rather than at the book itself. "Not anger," said Miss Marple at last. "Not protest. Not even quite grief." "No," said Miss Helen quietly. Something more precise than that. She trusted the kindness. Miss Marple said nothing. That is what it means, Miss Helen went on. Not simply that she was excluded, but that she had believed herself among people whose goodwill was genuine. The injury was not merely in the rejection. It was in discovering that the goodwill had conditions she had never been told existed. Miss Marple thought this exactly right. She turned back a few pages to Miranda's costume studies, looked again at the careful line, the practical thought, the pleasure a person takes in work that engages both hand and mind. Those pages now stood in relation to the penciled sentence near the turn, back with a force that needed no commentary. Here was investment, trust, participation, and here, afterward, was the brief record of its withdrawal. Presently she closed the sketchbook. Mrs. Belling's niece, she said, Caroline Marsh, the engagement that was being protected, whatever became of it. Miss Helen's expression altered slightly into something that was not quite irony and not quite sorrow, but occupied a thoughtful territory between the two. It did not prosper, she said. The young man, Fowler, I believe, the parish treasurer's son, discovered, or perhaps admitted, that his inclinations lay elsewhere than his family had hoped. The engagement ended before Christmas. Quietly, of course, managed with a great deal of tact and discretion, though in circumstances infinitely more comfortable than those afforded to Evelyn. Miss Marple stood quite still with the closed sketchbook in her hands. So, the thing so carefully protected, she said at last, did not in fact require protection, and the protection offered to it destroyed something that did not need destroying. Yes, said Miss Helen simply. They stood for a little while in the doorway without speaking. The understanding between them required no embellishment. Then Miss Helen observed, in a tone more practical, that they ought probably to return the key before the post office closed. Miss Marple agreed. She locked the pavilion, and they walked back across the recreation ground together, while a troop of children engaged in some elaborate and wholly absorbing game streamed past them in the opposite direction, with the complete conviction that their own affairs were by far the most important in the world. Miss Marple carried the sketchbook under her arm. She had asked Miss Helen if she might keep it for the present, and permission had been granted at once, almost before the question had properly formed. What remained now, Miss Marple thought, was the brook itself. The place where the reticule had been hidden, and the sequence of hours between Mrs. Belling's words at the Rectory gate and Evelyn's departure from St. Mary Mead. She had by now a fairly complete understanding of the people, the motives, and the decisions. What she lacked was a sufficient sense of Evelyn's last movements through the village on that evening in June. The sketchbook had told her what Evelyn felt. The brook, she thought, might yet tell her what Evelyn decided. Chapter 8. Miller's Brook at Low Tide. By the second week of June, Miller's Brook had settled into that composed and self-sufficient condition peculiar to English streams once the business of spring has been concluded. It ran clear over pale stones at perhaps a third of its winter depth, moving without haste, reflecting sky and leaf with an air of having nowhere particular to be. The meadow grasses along its banks had grown tall in the generous warmth of the season, and the air held that agreeable mingling of flowering hay and cool mineral water which belongs only to the countryside at such times, and which Miss Marple had always associated with an almost involuntary sense of well-being. She walked the meadow path on Monday morning, choosing the hour deliberately for quiet. The repairs to the footbridge had been completed some days earlier, and Hobbs and his men were now occupied farther along the bank, which left the bridge itself undisturbed. The lower meadow lay nearly empty, save for a heron stationed upstream at a bend in the brook, with the magnificent indifference which herons alone among birds seem to have perfected. The bridge revealed itself at the turn of the path, a low arch of local grey stone, unpretentious, durable, and very much of the district. The newly repaired section showed pale against the darker weathered courses, not yet mellowed into full agreement with them, though sound and carefully set. Miss Marple paused at the centre of the bridge and looked down at the water, below. The cavity in which the reticule had rested was now sealed with fresh mortar and stone so neatly placed that one would never, without prior knowledge, have suspected anything unusual had ever existed there. Hobbs had worked with the satisfaction of a good craftsman, whose finest repairs are often those that efface all evidence of themselves. Miss Marple remained where she was for some minutes, thinking through the evening of the 14th of June, 1936. Mrs. Belling had spoken to Evelyn at the Rectory gate sometime after 6, if Mrs. Finch's recollection could be trusted, and Miss Marple saw no reason why it should not be. The words used had been sufficient to tell Evelyn that she was no longer wanted where she had expected fellowship. The rehearsal, though cancelled 2 days earlier in committee, had not been properly communicated to all concerned, which suggested that some part of the desired effect had indeed depended upon silence. There is a particular cruelty in the empty room one is expected to discover for oneself. But Evelyn had not gone on to the hall. That was the point which now seemed most revealing. Instead, she had gone to the brook. Miss Marple crossed the bridge and made her way carefully down the bank to where the downstream face of the arch was plainly visible. The water ran shallow and clear here, and the repaired section stood at about shoulder height to anyone on the bank. One could see at once that the cavity had not been an accidental fissure into which an object might casually have been dropped. It had been a space known, or at least discovered and remembered. The stone that once covered it had fitted flush with its neighbours. A person would not stumble upon such a hiding place by chance. She stood on the grass and looked at the repaired section. Evelyn, she thought, had known this place. She had probably stood there before, perhaps often, watching the brook at summer level in that private way people come to know a familiar corner of the world. She had known that one block could be moved. She had known that something might be left there in safety and later recovered. Whether she had carried the reticule with her already, or whether she had retrieved it from the pavilion shelf before turning toward the meadow, Miss Marple could not say. But of one thing she was increasingly certain. The reticule had not been hidden in the spirit of destruction. It had been deposited. That distinction mattered. The theatre programme, the silver hairpin, the folded slip with the initials, these were not random contents, nor the whole of a life. They were a small representative portion of Evelyn's place in the village's theatrical world, chosen and put aside with intention. The bridge was not on the direct route from the Rectory gate either to the hall or to the rooms above the lending library where Evelyn had lived. To go there required choice. It was a detour made at an hour when the meadow would have been quiet and the light still long. Miss Marple found this, more than almost anything else in the case, unexpectedly moving. Not the memorandum in the Reverend's drawer, not Mr. Dodd's burdened honesty in the churchyard, not even the pencilled sentence in the sketchbook, but this, the optimism of the deposit, for that, she felt certain, was what it had been. Not abandonment, not despair, but a temporary placing aside. A young woman wounded by the conduct of others, yet still believing the difficulty might pass. Still imagining, even after that encounter at the gate, that she would come back, that the village would in time right itself sufficiently for her to reclaim what she had left in trust. At 23, one has a particular relationship with the future. It is not that one is foolish, exactly, but that one still assumes resolution belongs naturally to life, that circumstances alter, that the painful thing is seldom the final thing. The reticule in the bridge had not been an act of resignation. It had been an act of practical hope. That she never returned to claim it did not alter the original nature of the gesture. It meant only that time, distance, and whatever life afterward required of her had hardened the temporary into permanence while the little bag remained in darkness, patient and undisturbed, for 25 years. Miss Marple stayed there longer than observation strictly demanded. There are places, she thought, in which one ought to stand quietly for a little while simply because something significant has once occurred there and been insufficiently understood. Presently she heard footsteps on the path and turned to see Hobbs approaching with a bag of tools. He stopped when he saw her and raised his cap. "Morning, Miss Marple. Come to inspect our handiwork?" "To look at the brook," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "Your handiwork appears to need no inspection." Hobbs accepted this with the modest satisfaction of a man who values competent praise because he understands its basis. He came down the bank to stand beside her and regarded the repair with the proprietary approval of one who has put something right. 25 years that little bag sat there, he said reflectively. As near as makes no matter. Yes. The block was loose when I found it. Could have been loose for a very long time. Could have been worked loose deliberate too. I wouldn't care to say which for certain. "I suspect deliberate," said Miss Marple. He nodded, as if that accorded with his own private judgment. "Neat job, if so," he said. "Block fitted flush with the face. You'd never notice. Whoever put it there had a good eye." He had said whoever, but there was in his manner the natural assumption, unspoken yet quite clear, that he too had formed his view of whose hand had likely done it. "Mr. Hobbs," said Miss Marple, "when you opened the cavity, did you see any sign that the block had been moved more than once since first it was placed?" He considered with care. "The mortar behind was old," he said at length. "Original, likely enough. The block itself weren't mortared in, just seated against the others and held by the arch, so it could be moved without tools if a body had the patience. Whether it had been taken out and put back more than once, I couldn't honestly tell you. Nothing to prove it had, nothing to prove it hadn't." Miss Marple thanked him, and Hobbs went on along the meadow path with the steady, purposeful gait of a man who generally has some next useful thing awaiting him. She turned back toward the village. By now, she thought, the matter was assembled as fully as evidence required. The history, the motives, the sequence, the human failures, all stood in tolerably clear relation to one another. What remained was not discovery, but conversation. More particularly, one conversation. She had, in a sense, been preparing for it ever since the moment she saw the reticule on Hobbs's folded jacket and heard Mrs. Belling suggest with so much steadiness that it had merely been misplaced. Miss Marple walked home along the path with the brook beside her and the tall grasses brushing lightly against her skirt. That afternoon, she thought, she would call upon Mrs. Belling, and they would have tea, and they would speak very carefully about memory. Chapter 9. What Was Pledged by Candlelight. Mrs. Belling lived in a house on the upper lane that had settled its character many years earlier and had never since found the slightest reason to reconsider it. It was Georgian in its original bones and Victorian in its later additions, with a front garden maintained to so exact a standard that less disciplined neighbours had occasionally described it as intimidating, though never, naturally, within Mrs. Belling's hearing. The hollyhocks along the wall were staked with a precision that suggested the possible use of measuring instruments, and the gravel path from gate to door possessed that degree of neatness which makes the rest of a village appear, by comparison, faintly apologetic for itself. Miss Marple had telephoned that morning to ask whether she might call in the afternoon, presenting the visit in the guise of an ordinary social courtesy between two women long acquainted with one another, which it was, while being at the same time something rather more exacting. Mrs. Belling had received the request with the untroubled composure of a woman who believes herself perfectly capable of meeting whatever arrives at her door, and perhaps also, Miss Marple thought, with the additional steadiness of one who had seen over the previous week the general direction in which various inquiries were moving, and had expected them sooner or later to reach her own sitting room. She received Miss Marple in a room of considerable comfort and very decided order. Everything in it had the settled, deliberate placement of objects chosen by a person who thinks clearly in tidy spaces and experiences the dislocation of a cushion as a mild but genuine affront. Tea had already been prepared when Miss Marple arrived, which suggested either habitual hospitality or that more advanced kind of preparedness belonging to women who take social obligations seriously enough to anticipate them before they are fully required. In Mrs. Belling's case, Miss Marple thought, it was almost certainly both. For the first quarter of an hour they spoke of entirely other things, the bridge repairs now nearly complete, the prospects for the Women's Institute summer exhibition, upon which Mrs. Belling discoursed with the experienced authority of one who had organised it for 11 years, and found the subject no less engaging for familiarity. The exceptional condition of the hollyhocks, which had attracted admiring notice from Mrs. Hartley at number 7. Miss Marple contributed to each topic with genuine attention, and did not hasten the conversation, having found through long acquaintance with human defensiveness that the most effective approach to a difficult matter is often the most pleasant and indirect. It allows a person time enough to become comfortable before discovering that comfort will not in fact be permitted to remain. It was Mrs. Belling herself who made the turn. She set down her cup with the air of a woman who has reached a small internal conclusion, and said, in a tone more carefully chosen than the casual drift of the conversation strictly required, "I imagine you have been speaking to a number of people this past week about Evelyn Larch." "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "and to Miss Helen in particular. She's been very kind in sharing what she remembers." Mrs. Belling was quiet for a moment. She looked first at her teacup, then at the window, and then, with that directness which Miss Marple had always considered among her genuine virtues, even when it was put to uses one could not wholly admire, she looked straight at Miss Marple. "You will have formed a view," she said. "I have formed a picture," said Miss Marple, with that particular mildness she employed when she wished her words to carry more weight than their surface at first suggested. "A fairly complete one, I think, though there are one or two aspects of the matter on which I remain uncertain, and which I thought you might be able to clarify." Mrs. Belling inclined her head once and waited. "The memorandum," Miss Marple said, "the one addressed to Reverend Price, recommending that Evelyn be advised to withdraw from the Mead players. You will recall that he retained it, together with a note in his own hand indicating that you had undertaken to speak with her yourself." Something altered in Mrs. Belling's expression. It was not the sharp disturbance of surprise, but the more measured adjustment of a person who has been privately rehearsing a conversation of this kind, and now finds it has arrived in almost exactly the form anticipated. "I did speak with her," she said. "At the Rectory gate," said Miss Marple, "on the evening of the 14th. "Yes." A pause followed, brief but not empty. "I had called at the Rectory on another matter and was leaving by the garden passage when she arrived. It seemed to me that the opportunity presented itself, and that it would be kinder to speak directly than to allow her to go on to an empty hall and draw her own conclusions." Miss Marple considered this. It was entirely possible that Mrs. Belling had believed it at the time. It was also possible, indeed rather likely, that she had recognised the advantage of delivering unwelcome information in a controlled manner, under conditions chosen by herself, rather than leaving it to unfold unpredictably elsewhere. Such control is often described as kindness by those who possess it. "What did you say to her?" Miss Marple asked. The question was very simply put, and Miss Marple knew it to be the central one. Everything else, the memorandum, the committee meeting, the observed conversation on the croquet lawn, was architecture. This was the inhabited room at the centre of it. Mrs. Belling was silent for some moments. It was not, Miss Marple thought, an evasive silence. It had more the quality of a person conducting a retrospective audit, examining actions once performed with confidence and finding them less supportable under renewed inspection than they had seemed at the time. At last she said, "I told her that the committee had noted certain concerns, that her association with Mr. Hale had attracted comment of a kind the theatrical group could not easily accommodate while maintaining its standing in the village, that it would be best for everyone concerned if she stepped back from her involvement for the present, until the talk had died down and the situation resolved itself." She paused. "I said that this was in her own interest, as much as the group's." "And was it?" asked Miss Marple. The question lay between them in the room with that peculiar stillness belonging to questions that do not need enlargement. Mrs. Belling's hands, folded neatly in her lap with the habitual composure of a woman who had spent 40 years managing the business of committees and committees of committees, tightened very slightly. "No," she said, "not primarily." She said it without hesitation, and Miss Marple found that more significant than any attempt at mitigation would have been. "I was concerned about Caroline," Mrs. Belling went on, "about the engagement, about what any association between the theatrical group and romantic irregularity, or what I chose to regard as romantic irregularity, might do to a situation already somewhat delicate." She met Miss Marple's gaze with the expression of someone who has reached a truth by a route that cost her something and knows it. I told myself that I was acting in Evelyn's interest as well, that the talk was genuine and would damage her whether I intervened or not, but the talk was, in very large part, talk I had initiated. Miss Marple received the admission without outward emphasis, without any trace of triumph, and equally without the easier gesture of absolution. Both would have been, she felt, beside the point. "She said something to Mrs. Finch afterward," Miss Marple said. "She said she had not known that it required defending." Mrs. Belling closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, her face had acquired the particular stillness of a person who has lived with a thing for 25 years and has just heard it named with a precision greater than she had ever before allowed herself. "I implied," she said, "that her conduct had created a situation. I did not accuse her directly. I spoke of appearances, of the importance of appearances, and I suggested that she understood my meaning." She stopped. She was too perceptive not to understand the implication, and the implication, of course, was that there was something to be implied. "There was not," said Miss Marple. "No," said Mrs. Belling, "there was not. There was a conversation on a croquet lawn. Two people who found one another's company agreeable, nothing more than that. And I knew as much, or could have known it, if I had been willing to look at the thing as it was, instead of as it suited my purpose to consider it." The room was very quiet. From the front garden came the industrious sound of a bee, moving among the hollyhocks with the absorbed seriousness of a creature fully occupied by its own proper work. Miss Marple had heard much the same note outside Ash Manor some days earlier, and was beginning to think of it as the unofficial accompaniment to this investigation. "The engagement," she said after a moment. "Caroline's engagement to young Fowler. It did not proceed." "No." Mrs. Belling's voice was level. "It was dissolved in November of that same year. He was a decent young man, but not suited, as it turned out, to the arrangement he had entered into. It had nothing whatever to do with Evelyn, or the theatrical group, or any of the circumstances over which I had made myself so anxious." A brief pause. "The irony has not been lost on me." "Protecting one young lady," said Miss Marple gently, "may sometimes injure another." Mrs. Belling looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said. "I have thought about that sentence in various forms for 25 years, Miss Marple, without ever quite having the candour to complete it." She set down her cup with the precise movement of a woman placing something aside so that both hands may be free. "I was not cruel to Evelyn," she said. "I did not hate her. I did not wish her ill. I used her. I used her as a convenient sacrifice to preserve an arrangement that did not, in the end, require preserving at all, and I dressed the whole business in the language of concern and community standards until it was quite respectable enough to live with." Miss Marple said nothing, because nothing was required. After a little while, Mrs. Belling said, in a voice that had recovered much of its customary composure, though not all of it, "What I should like to know is whether she is living, whether Evelyn Larch is living still." "Miss Helen believes she is," said Miss Marple. "In Devon." "I see." Mrs. Belling nodded once with the expression of a person receiving information long needed, and not yet certain what shape it will take in the mind now that it has been received. They finished their tea in a quiet neither wholly comfortable nor wholly uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that follows necessary speech, like the air in a room after a window has been opened, and both occupants are adjusting themselves to the altered quality of it. Miss Marple walked home in the long evening light down the upper lane and past the post office, and along the narrow path between the gardens, thinking about the candour of a woman who had committed a wrong and had never until that afternoon found the exact form of words with which to name it plainly. It was not redemption, Miss Marple reflected. Something more modest than that, and perhaps for the same reason more real. It was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement in her long experience was always the necessary first step, the step without which nothing further was possible, and with which, sometimes, a very great deal was. Chapter 10. June Roses, Lining the Garden Path. The last week of June brought with it that particular quality of light that belongs to the English summer at its most accomplished. Long and golden in the evening, warm without aggression, and so clear that the village, to anyone seeing it for the first time, might have appeared to be arranged with very great care precisely for this moment. The roses along the garden paths were at their height. The copper beech at the corner had deepened into its fullest summer colour. The honeysuckle on the lending library wall had achieved one of those rare seasons in which it fulfilled, rather than merely suggested, its annual promise. Miss Marple was in her garden on Wednesday morning when Mrs. Dolly Bantry came through the gate, with the easy familiarity of an old friend who has long since dispensed with the formality of announced arrival, and wears her affection for the people she visits as comfortably as her gardening coat. Mrs. Bantry settled herself in one of the garden chairs, with the authority of a woman perfectly at ease in her own place in the world and in other people's gardens, and accepted a cup of coffee with the unaffected pleasure she brought to all simple things. She had heard, by what mechanism one never quite knew, though St. Mary Mead was remarkably efficient in such matters, that there had been developments in the business of the bridge, the velvet reticule, and Evelyn Larch, and she had come, partly in the spirit of friendship, partly from a sincere interest in justice, and partly, too, it must be admitted, from a perfectly natural wish to hear a proper account of how the truth had been arrived at. Miss Marple gave it to her over the course of a comfortable hour among the roses, while a blackbird in the apple tree provided the musical accompaniment with that unself-conscious excellence peculiar to creatures who perform not for audience, but because the thing itself requires doing. She told Mrs. Bantry what the parish records had revealed, and what Mrs. Finch had seen at the gate. She told her what had been written in the sketchbook, and what the Brook itself had suggested about Evelyn's state of mind on the evening she left. She described Mr. Dodd's grave acknowledgment in the churchyard, the memorandum in the Reverend Price's locked drawer, and finally the conversation in Mrs. Belling's sitting-room, with the precisely staked hollyhocks visible through the window in which Mrs. Belling had arrived, by the uncomfortable route of honesty, at the admission that she had sacrificed one young woman to preserve an arrangement that had not in the end survived the year. Mrs. Bantry listened with that attentive silence which was one of her considerable virtues. She was not a woman who felt obliged to produce continuous commentary on what she heard. She received a thing whole, thought about it properly, and then spoke. "Poor Evelyn," she said at last. "All that weight to carry to Devon for something that turned out to be nothing." "For something that was made to seem considerable," said Miss Marple, "by a person with a gift for making things appear what she wished them to appear, which is, in its quiet way, a more serious sort of wrong than a dramatic one, because it is so much harder to identify for what it is." Mrs. Bantry considered this with a faint furrow between her brows. "And what happens now?" she asked. "Something has happened already," said Miss Marple. She described the notice that had appeared that morning in the parish circular, a single, modest paragraph, placed between the announcement of the Flower Festival rota and a reminder concerning the forthcoming collection for the church roof. It was, Miss Marple observed, exactly the position traditionally reserved for matters of significance, not intended to become the subject of extended public excitement. The notice acknowledged Evelyn Larch's contribution to the village's theatrical life during the 1930s, expressed regret for what it called misunderstandings of the past, and offered, on behalf of the Mead players' successors and the parish community more generally, belated thanks for her gifts and her service. The language was measured and somewhat imprecise, as public acknowledgments often are when they are genuine in intention but constrained by the form in which they must appear. It was not confession, it was not accusation, it was within the limits of what a parish circular can reasonably be expected to contain, as much truth as the medium could sustain. "Miss Helen wrote it," said Miss Marple. She asked my opinion of the draft, and I suggested only one small alteration in the second sentence, a matter of phrasing which seemed to distribute responsibility rather more thinly than the situation warranted. She made the change at once. Mrs. Bantry smiled. "And Mrs. Belling?" "Mrs. Belling has resigned her position as committee secretary, citing her age and the demands of the post upon her remaining energy. The resignation was received with the gratitude and regret appropriate to 11 years of dedicated service." Miss Marple's voice carried no irony, because she felt none. The resignation was what it was, and what it was included both an entirely proper acknowledgement of real service and a quieter acknowledgement of something else. There was no reason the two could not coexist within the same act. "She has also, I believe, written a personal letter to Miss Helen. Whether that letter will find its way, in some form, to Devon, I cannot say. That is between them." She lifted her coffee cup and let the morning settle around them for a moment. The roses, the blackbird, and somewhere beyond the lane, the distant seasonal buzz of a lawnmower proceeding dutifully with its purpose. "And the reticule itself?" asked Mrs. Bantry. "Miss Helen has written to Evelyn," said Miss Marple. "The letter was sent yesterday. It enclosed the reticule, the hairpin, the theatre programme, and the folded paper, together with a brief account of how they were found, and an invitation to correspond, along with whatever else Miss Helen wished to say, which is naturally her own affair." Mrs. Bantry was quiet a little while. Then she said, in that different tone people use when they have been thinking something for some time and have waited until the conversation is ready to receive it, "Do you think she will write back?" Miss Marple considered the question with the care it deserved, because it was not in truth only a question about letters. It was about whether the injury done to a young woman of 23 in the summer of 1936 was the kind of injury that 25 years, a modest note in a parish circular, and a letter from an old friend might begin, however partially, to address. "At the bridge," she said at last, "Evelyn placed that reticule in the stone with the intention of returning for it. Of that I feel quite certain. And I think that whatever prevented her return was not indifference, and certainly not forgetting, but the ordinary accumulation of life lived elsewhere, new circumstances, new attachments, new reasons to remain where one has gone rather than come back to where one has been." She paused. "I think the reticule will reach her as an object she recognises at once, and that recognising it will be both a sadness and a kind of relief." Another pause. "Whether she will write back, I cannot say, but I think she may." Mrs. Bantry nodded in the way she did when something struck her as both true and sufficient, and did not press the matter further. They sat together in comfortable companionship for some time after that. At last Mrs. Bantry announced that she had promised to look in on the Flower Festival Committee before noon, rose, and departed with the same cheerful informality with which she had arrived, pausing only to express admiration for a deep pink climber near the back wall, the name of which Miss Marple had unfortunately forgotten and had been meaning to look up in a reference book she had not, amid recent events, quite got round to consulting. Miss Marple remained in the garden after she'd gone. The morning had the quality of something that had settled back into its proper arrangement after a period of disturbance, the way the surface of a pond smooths itself after a stone has been thrown into it. Not unchanged, certainly, but restored to pattern. She thought about what villagers do with their pasts, not dishonestly, necessarily, and not always from malice, but from a deeply human preference for versions of events that everyone can bear to live beside. A preference that sometimes requires the pruning of inconvenient memory in much the same spirit as a hedge is pruned, shaping what is visible, reducing what does not suit the desired outline. It is a tendency that produces very tidy hedges and a considerable amount of quiet suffering in the people who have, as it were, been trimmed. She thought of Evelyn Larch somewhere in Devon, living a life that likely had no regular occasion to consider Miller's Brook, the Mead players, or the stone arch of a footbridge at the lower edge of the meadow. She thought of the reticule travelling south by post, its contents wrapped in tissue paper, by Miss Helen's careful hands, carrying back with it the small accumulated tokens of a part of life interrupted before it had been properly concluded. And she thought of return, what that word comes to mean when both the person and the place have changed, and when returning can no longer be the simple reversal once imagined, not lesser than what was hoped for, necessarily, merely different, as most honest reckonings with the past turn out to be, not the restoration of a lost thing entire, but the making of something new from what remains of it. The blackbird had finished singing and moved on to other business. The June roses were very fine. St. Mary Mead resumed its measured rhythms, as it always did, as it always would. And this time, in the matter of Evelyn Larch at least, it remembered. Quietly, imperfectly, but perhaps a little more honestly than before.